Okay, welcome back everyone. What I've got with me today is this Karabiner Model 98 cruise rifle, also known as the K98k, the K98k, or the K98 short rifle. The proper English designation would be the Carbine Model 98 short rifle. Trust me, this will all make sense in a minute. Many of you are probably familiar with this rifle already if you've ever seen a World War II film or played any World War II games involving the Germans. This was, of course, the standard shoulder arm for the German armed forces in World War II, and while it's simply a derivative of earlier Model 98 Mausers, it's probably the most iconic and recognizable Mauser because of its appearance in films and the popularity of World War II as a historical subject. The K98k weighs about 8.6 pounds with an overall length of 43.6 inches with a barrel length of 23.6 inches. And this is a pretty typical length for a World War II era rifle. For comparison, the American M1 Garand has a 24-inch barrel and the British Lee Enfield has a 25.2-inch barrel. It also has a bayonet lug in the front, a side-mounted strap, and has an internal magazine that holds 5 8mm cartridges. The K98k was not a paradigm shift of weapons technology by the time of the Second World War, nor did it have an effect on the outcome of the conflict. However, it was a rugged, reliable, and accurate weapon that was very popular with the average soldier. It could easily operate and be maintained in almost every natural environment, most notably on the Eastern Front in cold weather conditions, at least up to a certain point, as well as desert conditions, where it could be sandy as well as very cold at the same time. The K98k was pretty much an all-in-one rifle that could be used interchangeably by all the various roles of the German armed forces that required rifles. Most world militaries had moved away from the model of having two different rifles and carbines and instead had one universal rifle that could be used by all infantry roles. The US and Italy sort of being the main exception to that rule, where the US M1 Garand was of course a long rifle, and then you had the M1 carbine was their carbine, and then the Italians had their long rifle. And then they also had the various carbines that they used, though they tried to create one universal rifle, but that's kind of a story for a different video. Of course, submachine guns, notwithstanding roles that required rifles, those were also heavily used in World War II by pretty much every nation. Additionally, by World War II, German squad tactics revolved around the machine gun, where a squad's firepower came primarily from a deployable heavy machine gun, and the individual riflemen were there to provide cover and run ammo to these machine gun crews. The K98k performed well here for the average rifleman, and his firepower was also supplemented by submachine guns. So in order to help you guys understand this gun's lineage, I'm going to take you back for a minute. On April 5th, 1898, Germany adopted a new rifle for its armed forces, the Model 98, or the Gewehr 98 infantry rifle. It had several notable features like a large ring receiver, an additional safety bolt lug, and they standardized the use of the 8mm Mauser cartridge. This long rifle served Germany through the First World War, and just like many nations, Germany developed a carbine or a shortened version of the Model 98 that they could issue to cavalry units and non-infantry roles like machine gun crews. This was designated the Karabiner Model 98AZ. The biggest change here was a shortened barrel of 23 inches and a bent down bolt for a more balanced weight. These carbines became progressively more common on the front lines as shorter rifles were more conducive to short distance trench warfare in the First World War. In post-war 1920s Germany, in order to comply with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, their army was limited to just over 100,000 rifles and 20,000 some odd carbines. Developed between 1922 and 1926, they tweaked the Model 98 design by adding a turn-down bolt handle, a side-mounted sling, and a flat tangent sights, resulting in the newly designated Carbine Model 98B. At a barrel length of 29 inches, they were longer than the Karabiner 98AZ, but shorter than the original Model 98 long rifles. Germany also took many Model 98 long rifles and upgraded them to this new 98B configuration. It's hard to imagine them being called carbines because of the barrel length, but it allowed Germany to have more rifles under the treaty restrictions. So the carbine nomenclature in the Karabiner 98B name was really just for political reasons. This officially served as Germany's main post-war rifle until 1935. However, starting in the mid-1920s, the Mauser Corporation decided it wanted to start making rifles for the export market, and by the early 1930s, a program of secret rearmament had emerged after Hitler came to power, making it easier for companies to sell weapons abroad. For this purpose, Mauser developed several of their own shorter variations of the Model 98. The first one called the Standard Model, versions of which were sold to General Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces in China. In 1933, they introduced the Mauser Banner Rifle, which were sold as guns for use by the German post office. However, many of these were really purchased for use by Nazi paramilitary organizations. So was the later variation standard model short rifle made by Mauser the true predecessor to the K98k? Appearance-wise, it does look very similar, but the answer is no. In 1920 and 1930, the German army tested their own shortened version of the K98B and decided this was the best one to adopt. These had the same wall thickness as the K98Bs and were considered more handy than Mauser's standard model rifle. By 1935, the newly approved rifle was designated the Karabiner 98 Kurz, or short rifle, because it's a shortened version of the Karabiner 98B. It was adopted by all branches of the German armed forces, and even though the army had picked this rifle to be the new long arm of the German army, they waited until formal rearmament to begin before standardizing it across all branches. There were at least a dozen manufacturers in Germany during the Third Reich period making 98Ks. From 1935 to 1945, over 14 million of these were manufactured. Mauser Works made over 1 million rifles alone in 1943, the year of this rifle, with another half a dozen manufacturers making well over 1 million combined that year. These seem like rather large numbers, but you have to remember that rifles were being replaced constantly as many were destroyed in combat, captured, or otherwise taken out of service. Think of large battles like Stalingrad, where millions of rifles ended up captured or destroyed in combat. After 1942, the quality of material and heat treatment in the manufacturing of these rifles did vary. Factories were a main target of Allied bombings, which of course destroyed a lot of infrastructure. There was a shortage of skilled labor, and slave labor was increasingly used to fill in those gaps, and so the overall quality control suffered. Add a shortage of material and time, and you'll start to see a lot more stamped sheet metal over finely milled parts. On this rifle in particular, the trigger guard, the retaining bands, and the butt plate are all sheet stamped or have been hastily milled. Well, anyway, guys, with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at this rifle up close. All right, looking at the left side of the barrel, we see a Waffenamt Proof Acceptance Mark, or a Weapons Office Acceptance Mark. Moving up to the side of the receiver, we see another acceptance mark right here and a serial code followed by a letter code. So this is C right here. As with other 98s, production runs were often in blocks of 10,000 rifles per letter code, and then they would start over with the next letter in the series. In this case, the next letter would be D. If they didn't do this, they'd have serial numbers running into the millions, and this is just a much easier way to numerically solve this, and it's also partially to conceal the quantity of production. And then it's also up here marked Model 98. Looking at the top of the receiver, it's marked with a manufacturer's code, BYF43, which denotes Mauser AG Oberndorf, 1943. This was, of course, the Mauser Corporation. Prior to 1941, they used a number code to denote the manufacturer, sometimes with a letter prefix, but afterwards switched to the letter prefix standard, which could be 2 to 3 letters. Above the manufacturer code is another Weapons Office mark. Looking at a little bit further, we have a bent down bolt handle, and then on the bolt itself, we have a serial number that is electro-penciled onto it that matches the receiver. This indicates that it was arsenal refurbished by Russia or Czechoslovakia using mixed parts after the war. Because there's another serial number here that is etched out, this means that it was previously on another arsenal refurbished rifle, so this bolt was used on at least 2 other rifles at one point. Additionally, Russian captured K98 rifles typically had any Waffenamt markings peened off, but that wasn't always the case, and sometimes they would put a large X stamp on the receiver. You'll find many variations of arsenal refurbished K98 rifles, sometimes with reblued metal or with a thick shellac finish slapped on the stock of Russian captured examples. You have to remember that all these parts were interchangeable, so they were all broken down, parts were thrown into boxes, and then reassembled years later by various countries. The K98K has a typical Mauser half-turn leaf safety system. When the safety knob is turned all the way to the right, it engages the safety fully and locks the bolt, and the firing pin cannot be released. When all the way to the left, the rifle is fully ready to fire. Looking at the bottom, we have this elongated stamped trigger guard made for gloved fingers, which is a post-war Czechoslovakian addition that was added to many rebuilt rifles. As a note, some people will claim that these were made for issue to soldiers on the Eastern Front so they could use them with winter gloves, but this was never ever the case. These were never issued to German troops during World War II and are a completely post-war addition to these K98K rifles. Now, the Germans did, however, make winter triggers that could fit around the actual trigger guard that would just enclose it, and then you could pull a little button that would pull the trigger internally, but I'm not sure how widespread these were issued. The rear sights on the K98K are flat tangent curve and graduate from 100 to 2,000 meters using this adjustable slide. One of the design changes they made to the K98K compared to the older 98 models was dropping the minimum range to 100 meters. On the World War I Gewehr 98 sights, the minimum range was 400 meters. As distances between battlefield combatants dropped, 400 meters was far too long for minimum range. Looking at the front of the rifle, the front band retainer is representative of a mid to late war one. It's just stamped sheet metal with 3 weld points on each side, again to save time and resources in the manufacturing process. Early war band retainers were basically unchanged from the World War I Gewehr 98s. They had this nice H-shape milled into them in order to help reduce weight. Late war rifles also had these sheet metal front hood sights on them, which was actually an improvement over the early war ones, which were just detachable muzzle caps. And then of course we have the bayonet lug here and the cleaning rod. And then if we move it up a little bit, you can also see the front barrel band is just milled, but a little less refined where the strap loop is. So as you can see, it's a little bit more squared off than rounded. Under the barrel here is an import mark by Tennessee Guns International, which I believe brought in a large amount of surplus K98s from the Czech Republic in the early 1990s. From about, I believe, the 1970s to today, all surplus military rifles that are brought into the country have to be surplus, or they have to be import marked and stamped somewhere visible on the gun. The stock is a 2-piece set made of beechwood. You have the upper handguard here, and then the 1-piece stock going across the length of the rifle. And then on the bolt side of the stock, we see this bolt relief here, which gives the shooter a little bit more room to operate the bent down bolt more comfortably. We also see this washer-style disc built into the buttstock, which is actually a bolt disassembly device. This was so when you're putting pressure on the bolt spring, it gave something for the firing pin to go into, so you didn't risk breaking it. The K98 had 2 common variations of a butt plate, flat and cupped. Up until 1940, they were flat, and then they adopted a cupped butt plate, which fits snugly over a recessed cut stock. The reason for this transition to a sheet steel cut plate was to prevent laminations in the stock from separating and to increase the general durability of the stock. A quick mention, but the K98K was accompanied by a bladed bayonet officially named the Seitengewehr 84-98-3. It had a blade length of 9.9 inches and a total length of 15.2 inches. The maker's mark on the K98K is on the bottom of the blade itself. This is 1944 dated. And then on the other hand is the serial number. And then its handle grips were made out of a brown colored bakelite, which was an early form of synthetic plastic. It's also fitted into this frog attachment and sheath that goes nicely around the wearer's belt. Now, one noticeable disadvantage was the 5-round magazine limit, which compared to its British and American counterparts definitely decreased its firepower. However, to the millions of soldiers that were issued this rifle and were trained with it, it could be loaded quickly and it would encourage one to conserve ammunition. By 1945, the production situation was so bad that we see various parts of this rifle omitted, like the bayonet lug, the cleaning rod, and anything that could be stamped or welded was. This was similar to the nomenclature given to late war manufacturer Type 99s that are called last-ditch rifles. If you want to see a more detailed comparison of the various K98Ks made throughout the war, Ian McCollum over at Forgotten Weapons has a very detailed video that I'll share in the description. Now, in order to make up for the firepower disadvantage that bolt-action rifles had against semi-automatic rifles like the American M1 Garand or the Soviet SVTs, Germany tried to mass-produce their own semi-automatic rifles like the Gewehr 43 or even the STG 44s. While these, in theory, would have replaced every K98K on the battlefield, by the end of the war, it was just too late to mass-produce them in large enough numbers to basically be fielded by every soldier. After the conclusion of World War II, millions of these rifles made their way all over the world. Most of them ended up in East Germany, Yugoslavia, France, and China. Russia gave large amounts of captured K98Ks to Czechoslovakia, who then refurbished and exported them to countries like Israel and Ethiopia. Israel heavily used the K98K and had most of theirs rebarreled to 7.62 NATO. The Norwegians had adopted the American M1 Garand after the war, but had also acquired a large stockpile of 98s left behind by the Germans and had converted theirs to 30-06 so they could use ammo interchangeably with the M1 Garand. All in all, this is a great rifle and it's a blast to take out to the range. It's accurate and strikes a really good balance between weight and recoil. Just has that classic look and will definitely draw some attention if you bring it to the range. The information I used for this video comes from the book Mauser Bolt Rifles 3rd edition by Ludwig Olson. This was, of course, the holy grail of Mauser books that a lot of collectors reference and use. I'll leave a link to this book in the video description as a reference. But again, if you guys like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.